good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth lecture in our series of lectures on modern issues in the arts. I'm Marlene Lockheed, a member of the Princeton Adult School Board, and I'm here to tell you to turn off your cell phones, pagers, and other noise-making objects. And we'll probably dim the lights so that we can see the images of the show more clearly. And it's an enormous pleasure on my part to introduce tonight's speaker. Now, she is a long-time Princeton resident, and she needs little introduction. She's a noted artist and art educator, and many of our homes are graced with her works. But just as a reminder, Judith Brodsky is Distinguished Professor Emerita in the Department of Visual Arts at Rutgers University. She formerly served as Dean, Associate Provost, and Chair of the Newark's Campus Art Department. She's held numerous leadership roles in national art organizations, including the National President of Art Table, an organization of 1,200 women in leadership positions in the visual arts, President of the College Art Association, and National President of the Women's Caucus for Art, which was established 4 decades ago to promote equity for women artists and art professionals. She is the co-founder of the Institute for Women in Art at Rutgers University, and her leadership in establishing the Rutgers Center for Innovative Print and Paper in New Jersey was acknowledged when it was renamed the Brodsky Center for Innovative Editions in her honor. She is a printmaker and an artist whose work is in the permanent collections of over 100 museums and corporations. And it's my extreme pleasure to introduce my friend, Professor Judith K. Brodsky, who will be speaking on the topic, My Life in Art.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. A little echoey. Yeah. Or is it just, okay. Before we start, I just, to satisfy my curiosity, how many people in the audience are artists? Okay. How many people in the audience are collectors? Oh, good. That's very nice to see. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit to begin with about the Venice Biennale. There are so many different worlds in the field of the visual arts, and some of these worlds we know very well. I'm sure many of you are aware of the local world, the Arts Council of Princeton, the Princeton University Art Museum, the Newark Museum, and many of you may be familiar with some of the galleries that are in New Jersey, and certainly with some of the artists who live here. So that's one world. Another world is the world of the art galleries, and even that world is divided into different worlds. There's the world of the uptown galleries, and then there's the world of the downtown galleries, particularly the Chelsea galleries, which feature the most contemporary work in New York. Then there's the world of the major museums, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the museums in the major cities of the world. So there's a lot of different worlds that go on, and we move from one to the other with some difficulty at times, and sometimes with ease from one to the other. So one of these worlds is the world of the Biennales. And the Venice Biennale, of course, is the grandfather or the grandmother of Biennales, but there are Biennales now all over the world. There's the Johannesburg Biennale, the Istanbul Biennale, which took place earlier this year. There are now Biennales of a sort in the United States, cite Santa Fe or Philographica in Philadelphia, which is devoted to the printed image. There are biennales in Asia. So it is a world unto itself, and there seems to be a group of curators, a group of artists that move from biennale to biennale, and a group of spectators that move from biennale to biennale. So my husband and I were in Italy just a couple of weeks ago, and we decided, since we were in Italy, we were there for a completely different purpose. Nevertheless, it would be nothing to just hop over to Venice by train to see a little bit of the Biennale. So I thought I would start with that particular world. Did any of you go to the Venice Biennale this year? Okay, so it'll be my pleasure to tell you a little bit about it. Okay, so Venice. Venice, San Marco Piazza in the last week of October. A little bit chilly, but a nice bright day, and everybody sitting outside. I just had to start with this. Music playing in the Piazza San Marco. And there are my husband Michael and me, looking a little bit chilly. We're sitting actually not in San Marco Piazza at that point, but in the Biennale grounds themselves. And I had just been knocked down about an hour before that by a spectator rushing to the finish line of the Venice Marathon, which was on that week. So if I'm looking a little, pale and a little shaky, it's because of that. So in spite of that, we managed to get around through a good deal of the Biennale. And I'm just going to show you what I considered some of the highlights, and also to talk a little bit about what I felt it showed about what was happening in art around the globe. So this particular installation was in the Central Hall, which consisted of an exhibition called Illuminations. The curator was a woman named Bice Curators. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And the particular piece you're looking at are fake birds that were installed in the rafters all over this particular building. And these fake birds, which of course refer to the pigeons in San Marco Piazza, they're by Maurizio Catalan, whose big retrospective just opened a few days ago at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And these were actually shown at an earlier Venice Biennale, but Bice Curators wanted to reference the city of Venice. And as you'll see, a number of the pieces that were on display by the artists that she had chosen do make reference to the city. Here is another gallery with the birds, and on the walls, paintings by Christopher Wool. Interestingly enough, in terms of her reference to Venice, the main room in her exhibition was not a room displaying contemporary art, but rather a room in which she reinstalled 3 enormous Tintoretto paintings, which were just magnificent to see. One is usually used to seeing them in their other locations in churches, San Rocco, Scuola, and so on and so forth in Venice. So to see them within the context of this contemporary art exhibition was quite a surprise, actually, and makes you look at them from a completely different perspective. One of those perspectives being this kind of almost dreamlike surrealist quality. Of course, Tintoretto didn't know anything about surrealism since it wasn't thought of, for several centuries later. But nevertheless, there is this kind of dreamlike quality to these paintings that comes out in this particular setting. There were a number of young artists whose work had been selected for the exhibition, and some artists that are not so familiar to us in the United States. This was an installation by a young British artist, Haroon Mirza, and you're looking at the lighted part of the exhibition, but also had a big sound component. And sound is one of the things that artists, visual artists at the moment, are exploring. There's been a real blurring of distinction between visual material and sound elements. And the sound in this particular room was absolutely riveting. It was a rhythm that might have been African in origin. It certainly had elements of hip-hop in it, and it was a very insistent pounding rhythm that continued as you looked at the lighted elements in the installation. Another room in the Illuminations exhibition was a room of large drawings, and these works were, if not as big as the image that you're looking at on the screen, not far from that size. And they were by an Ethiopian artist whose name is Gedewan, and they were very intricate and quite beautiful to look at. A lot of the work in the Biennale was very carefully crafted, even when it was conceptual in nature. And that's kind of a switch to move away from art that looks kind of rough and ready to art that is quite beautiful in the way in which it's been put together. Many of you may be familiar with the work of Cindy Sherman, the American artist, whose early work you've seen probably the most. Her early work was a series of stills, of photographs in which she imitated movie stills and dressed herself in the costumes and the personas of the conventional stereotypes of young women appearing in film. The nurse, the teacher, the young actress coming to New York. And it was through those particular images that Cindy Sherman became known. She's always used herself in her art. So her art is all about self-portraiture and taking on these different roles. So this particular room had these giant images. The one that you're looking at, that you can see most clearly, she's dressed in a body suit, in a complete suit that of course mimics the nude body. Other parts of the room had kind of a garden look to them, and again these large images of Sherman against this garden. My feeling was that it was about in some vague kind of way about the concept of what a woman is, but it also had to do with meditation. One of the figures, she was dressed as in an Indian outfit, and the way that was presented, I felt that she was talking about a more spiritual aspect of the persona that she wanted to take on. This was a particularly interesting room. This was a participatory room, and the artist calls himself or herself Norma Jean, which of course is Marilyn Monroe's original name. And no one knows who this artist is, nor does anyone know. I'm assuming the curator knows, since the curator was able to reach this artist, but has kept the confidentiality of this artist from being revealed to the world. And so no one knows what country this artist lives in, or indeed whether this artist is a man or a woman. Now, the walls were white, as you can see, and on the floor were all these bits and pieces of a plasticine, almost a Play-Doh kind of consistency to whatever the actual material was. And viewers coming into the room could do whatever they wanted with them. So some people wrote their names with it, other people made images, and you can see how the wall gets built up to be quite interesting, kind of a graffiti look to it. The other thing about this work is that it has a political connotation because the colors are the colors of the Arab flag. So why that reference is there, I thought there was a disconnect actually between the political aspect of this work and the physical presence of it. And I found the physical presence very interesting and absorbing, whereas the political aspect of it I didn't think really came across. This was an installation by a Polish artist, Monika Sosnowska, and it was a series of cubicles decorated with this quite lovely patterned wallpaper, and that's all it was. But against this were David Goldblatt's photographs of South Africa. He's a very well-known South African photographer, and the particular photographs that were displayed in these cubicles with this sort of very pretty wallpaper were photographs about criminals who had committed acts, and he photographed them back in the location where these acts had been committed. So there was this contrast of the violence or the implied violence in the photographs and this kind of elegant setting for them. This was a small piece. This is hardly what it looked like at the Biennale. And it was one of a long row of small-scale photographs about this big, and in each photograph there was something that was artificial, something that was fake, and something that was real. So in this particular instance, you see the billboard with the advertisement for the car, and then you see the real car in front of it. These were beautiful photographs and very interesting to look at. And it really the artist really pointed out the tension between the artificial, the fake, if you will, and the materiality of a real object or a real person. This was a real surprise, and I've lightened the photographs a little bit just so you could see more of what the piece consisted of. It was an installation, and the room itself was very dark. So when you walked into it, what you really saw was not the structure itself, but you saw the pattern of lights, you saw the reflections on the floor, and there were additional small lights that were reflected. What was interesting about this is this is the Saudi Arabian pavilion, and it's the first time that Saudi Arabia has participated in the Biennale, and what was the most surprising is that the artists were two women, two Saudi Arabian women. Now, I don't know them. I saw photographs of them, and the photographs I saw, they were not veiled, but they live in Paris most of the time. So I suspect that when they're back in Saudi Arabia, they will have to veil, of course, but most of their time is spent in Paris. But I thought it was extremely interesting that Saudi Arabia had chosen these women to represent the country, given the structure of gender within Saudi Arabia. The American pavilion was the site for an installation by a team of artists, Alora and Calzadilla. You may have seen the image of this upside-down tank because the New York Times picked it up and wrote a story about it. And at the opening of the Biennale, it was part of a performance, and you can see the runner at the top on the treadmill above the tank. And there were other aspects of their installation that were also performance-oriented. By the time that we got to see this, they were no longer doing the performances. We were actually there in some of the last days of the Biennale. So we didn't get to see some of this stuff being used by the performers. When you saw the tank upside down, It was very eye-catching object. It looks as if the my immediate thought was, oh, this is going to be an anti-war kind of installation. But the installation turned out to be quite different, and I wasn't really prepared for what it was by seeing the tank on the outside. So again, I wasn't sure whether the tank really worked within the concept of the interior. I thought the interior was very striking. When you walked in, the first thing you saw was this statue of an allegory figure of freedom in this tanning salon piece of equipment. And of course, you immediately think in terms of a coffin, and that really was more what this installation was about. I felt it was very much about death and dying. Perhaps the tank on the outside, the upside-down tank, was related, to the concept of death and dying. This particular part of the installation were the seats from business class seats from an airplane. And again, these were set up so that there was a performance that took place in them. Gymnasts used them as equipment to do their particular positions on. But I felt that these, again, were a reference to coffins, that when you're enclosed in airline seats, even more so than economy class, where I usually fly, these business class seats, kind of envelop people as if they're in a coffin. And then this kind of capped the whole thing for me. This was a giant organ that they had built with an ATM in the middle of it. And the organ played when you used the ATM. So again, I think the religion aspect of it, the death aspect of it, the consumerism aspect of it, I think that was all tied up in this particular installation. The Korean pavilion consisted of work by an artist named Lee Young-baek, and it was quite amazing technically. There were two very large statues, I'm showing you one of them, both of which, again, were about violence in this particular instance, and the other statue was sort of an image that was reminiscent of Madonna with the dead Christ across her lap. It wasn't quite that, but you couldn't help but make the connection. So there was that element of violence. It was amazing from the point of view of technology. This was a video that was running, and as you watched it, you realized that there were people that were moving across the screen. And if you look carefully, I don't know if it's clear enough, but if you look carefully in the middle of each of those images, you will see the hand of a person, and you can kind of make out the outline of the person. Now, it looks, so technically complex, but then this was how the artist did it, by clothing the people in garments that had the same pattern as the background. So I thought that was really kind of wonderful, that there was a simple solution, and yet it looked very mysterious and very technical when you observed it. Another part of this, and I just couldn't get a good picture of it, there were video images in which a piece of mirror, you hear the crack of the mirror, and then you see all the shards of it that go onto other video projections that are around the room. And it was really pretty terrifying to be in that room, because you sort of felt that the pieces of the mirror, the shards of the mirror, were coming right at you. The Japanese artist Taba Amo, she creates these environments, these installations that are based on drawings, very detailed drawings that she does, and then she animates the drawings. So if you can visualize a completely dark circular room, and you have walked into the middle of it, and around it is a view of a town, a city, with these kind of strange-looking buildings, and what looks like water in which the buildings are reflected, and you have no idea where you are. You feel completely uneasy. You feel threatened because you're so unsure of where you stand in relationship to all this. And then all kinds of weird things start to happen, like this giant finger that comes up from the water. You really become involved, and other things that are sort of weird kinds of things start to happen. So it was a very absorbing and interesting installation. Thomas Hirschhorn represented Switzerland, and his installation was called Crystal of Resistance. And you entered this pavilion, and you were surrounded by all of these structures that were made out of things like vinyl and masking tape, different kinds of plastic. And then there what looked like all kinds of debris and used devices, electronic devices of different kinds. All of this was covered in this kind of plastic, and the idea was that you entered a crystal. So there were things like these Barbie dolls that were arrayed on a shelf. Or if you look at these chairs, they're covered with old cell phones, and then the plastic put on top of it. So again, I felt this was, if not about death, then certainly about decay, about garbage, about the detritus of our lives. Urs Fischer was one of the artists chosen by B.J. Carija for the Illuminations exhibition. And this was how the piece looked when we saw it. It's made of wax, and the candle, the actual wick was lighted, and it was melting in front of our eyes. And this is what it looked like before it started to burn and melt. It's a complete wax replica of the statue of the Rape of the Sabine Women by Gian Bologna, which many of you have seen on your trips to Florence. It's in the Loggia dei Lanzi, which is right around the corner from the Uffizi Gallery. So it started out like this and ends up as a candle that's completely melted down. And he also had a candle that was a spectator. And so this is what the spectator looked like when we saw it, and this is what the spectator looked like originally. One of the most interesting installations was Christian Boltanski, whose work you may be familiar with, and he talked recently, earlier this fall, at the university, so some of you may have heard him talk. And he has done, all his work is very humanistic, and it centers around various aspects of life on a grand scale. And so in this installation, there were what looked like film strips that were blown up, large film strips that went all through this machinery that you saw in the first image. And it's called Chance, and it was about population growth. In another room, you saw these figures that kept changing. I think that one room, one set of figures, may have been recording the number of people who came to the Biennale and looked at the work in that pavilion. And then in another room, I think it was the figures leading up to the 7 billion figure that we all know we just passed. One of the most striking exhibitions was in the British Pavilion, and this is the exterior of the British Pavilion, and the line to go in, because they were limiting the number of people who could be in it at any one time, it took us about 20 minutes to half an hour before we were able to enter. And then at the entrance, they had someone posted who warns you to duck, that you're going to be going over uneven flooring, and you're going to be going through passages with uneven heights, and that you need to watch where you step. And they also warn you that if you're somebody with some balance problems, you may not want to go into this. So when you go in the inside, again, it's dark. And what you are surrounded with is what looks like abandoned buildings, or interiors of abandoned buildings. This is typical of one of the rooms. It looks as if there's people who are using leftover equipment and beds that have been left after some giant apocalyptic event that has taken place. Well, in reading the literature about it, apparently it's based on an old inn in Istanbul, which is historic and which looked like this and is now being restored. And the artist was making reference to Istanbul and its relationship to Venice, you know, and the interaction of East and West. I have to say that I didn't think any of that came through. And I felt this was another installation that was about decay and detritus, death of the world, in a sense. And I thought it was a very strong piece. The artist is Mike Nichols, but I didn't think that his idea of the cultural interchange, unless he was commenting on the fact that the cultural interchange didn't work or something, I don't think that that was very successful. Just to conclude, my little you know, piece about the Venice Biennale, this was extraordinary. And again, I've lightened it so that you could see a little bit more clearly what the installation looked like. It's by a filmmaker, artist named Christoph Schlingensief. And he's very well known in Germany, was very well known. He died just shortly before the Biennale opened, and the curator, the German curator, finished putting the exhibition together. And it was like a cathedral on the inside, but with all these projections around the wall that were about his battle with terminal cancer. And so the audio is all about chemotherapy and about, you know, how long he's going to live and, you know, what's going to happen, you know, to his family afterward. And then apparently the church interior is the one at which it's a replica of the one at which he was an altar boy when he was a child. So my feeling about, you know, artists in the world at the moment is that artists are reflecting some of the pessimism that all of us feel, that artists are not very optimistic or cheerful about what's going on in the world, and that their work is very much focused on these rather sad kinds of events rather than on the joyful aspect of life. So, we're going to do a complete switch now, okay? And I'm going to take you to my world, all right? Okay, okay. This is a picture of me when I was, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years old. As you can see, I want the whole world in my hands. I always knew I was going to be an artist. Apparently, I held a pencil in my hand and drew with it before I could walk or talk, and my parents knew I was destined to be an artist. The other aspect of my life, besides my central core as an artist, is my mobility. I need my wheels. Any of you who know me know that I've spent a lot of my life commuting to different places. I've lived in Princeton just about all my adult life, but I went to school and did my graduate work in Philadelphia, so I commuted to Philadelphia. I taught outside of Philadelphia. I taught at Rutgers Newark. I'm in New York 2 or 3 times a week, so my wheels are essential to me, and if I can't have my wheels, then I feel, you know, absolutely hemmed in and deprived. And as you'll see, my mobility, my travels have entered into my art as well. My parents encouraged me. This is my mother and my little brother. And my brother is a writer. He spent his career as a journalist. My parents were not very successful in having their children make a lot of money, but I think they were successful in encouraging us to do the things that we like to do. However, they didn't want me to go to art school. They insisted that I get a liberal arts degree, so here I am at graduation, where I was already married, this was in the 1950s when you did things like that, and I had a baby the following year, and so I actually delayed my career as an artist until my children started school, and then I went back to graduate school in Philadelphia at the Tyler School of Art, where this was now the mid-60s, and in the mid-60s, it wasn't yet a period in which anyone expected women to be going back to graduate school if they were married and had children. And I actually had men in my class who yelled at me and said, "You don't belong here, you know, you're married, you don't have to work for a living if you don't want to, and you're going to take a job away from us." So I got them, though, because I'd been an art history major and I knew a lot of big words, and so I discovered that in the class discussions, if I used some of those big words, then that shut them up. So that worked out very well. This is a picture of my children and my late husband when they're pretty well grown at this particular point, and by this time I was already launched into my teaching career, which has meant a great deal to me over my life. It's been a very exciting part of my life. Here I am at a senior thesis show, and for a number of years I ran the senior thesis program, which was a lot of fun for me. But then I got into university administration for a few years. People would ask me, you know, what was an artist doing in a position, you know, a deanship, or then I was associate provost of the Rutgers Newark campus, and I'd say, I'm doing a performance piece. And even though I was doing university administration, I always thought of it in the context of my artist center, my artist core, if you will, and it was always a creative process for me, so that I was consistently developing new programs. I was Rutgers University's point person in the city of Newark to work with the corporations and the city government on ways in which we could begin the process of bringing Newark back to its former glory. And I think we laid the groundwork during the early 1980s for what subsequently has followed in Newark, which has improved the city. It still has a long way to go, and unfortunately the economic downturn has slowed its progress, but we did achieve quite a lot in those days. And I invented this slogan, Newark is a college town, because Rutgers University was there, Seton Hall Law School, University of Medicine and Dentistry, Essex County College. So if you added up the number of students in Newark, there were 50,000 students in Newark, so it was a college town. And you know, my attempt to change people's perceptions of Newark and bring people back into the city. As I said before, my activities always fed back into my art, and after driving up and down the New Jersey Turnpike for 8 years while I was on the Rutgers Newark campus, I couldn't help but be influenced by the northern New Jersey industrial wasteland. and I did a project called The Meadowlands Strike Back, and it was an apocalyptic series of 15 lithographs, color lithographs, in which I used the imagery of the turnpike, the airport, the oil refineries, and developed an apocalyptic narrative in which everything begins to come apart and eventually everything goes up in flames and a new Garden of Eden arises in what used to be the Great Swamp, the Meadowlands Great Swamp of New Jersey. So this is one of the early pieces in the series, and these are the cranes that load the ships. And next time you go up the turnpike, if you look over at Port Elizabeth, you'll see these cranes, and you'll see how they really do resemble giant horses that are striding across the landscape. These are gas storage tanks, but if you look at the upper part of the image, I appropriated the angels from Giotto's Lamentation over the Dead Body of Christ, and here they're lamenting the presence of gas tanks in what used to be this great, glorious swamp. And here is what I call the garbage bag mountain, the landfills, which are nothing but garbage, of course. And if you notice the fish, even though they're kind of pretty looking, they're all belly up, they're all dead, and there are these giant flies that are gathering around the landfill. And then finally, everything goes up in flames. I used bears as a symbol because they have, such a place in our mythology. And here the bears are running away while the oil refineries go up in flames. And finally, here is the new paradise. It says, has the Garden of Eden been located at last? And you can see that these dinosaurs are coming back. And then on the left and the right, God is creating man and woman. But you have to have evil in paradise. The biblical evil, of course, is the serpent. In the 21st century, this was still, I created these images still in the end years of the 20th century. Garbage bags are falling from the sky and creating a new landfill. So one of the big involvements in my life has been the feminist art movement, which I have found to be not only something that's been very satisfying politically, to work towards social justice in the art world for women and artists of color, but also very intellectually and aesthetically important to me. And many of the ideas of the feminist art movement helped me to solidify my directions in my own creative work. What you're looking at here is a conference which took place in 1971 at the Corcoran in Washington. And it was the first time that women artists came together and began to talk about discrimination in the art world against women and minorities. And in the center you see June Wayne, who just died a few weeks ago, the founder of the Tamarind Lithography Workshop, on which I based my print center at Rutgers. There were all kinds of wonderful things that happened at this conference. For instance, the well-known artist Alice Neal came to the conference, and when she had to go to the bathroom, she lifted up her skirts and peed on the lawn instead of going to the ladies' room, because she said that's what Jackson Pollock had done, and if male artists could do it, then so could women artists. I had a lot of fun also in the feminist art movement. I organized the first conferences of the Women's Caucus for Art, which was a group that grew out of the College Art Association. We actually did the statistics that showed the degree of discrimination against women artists and art historians. And one of the first conferences that I organized was in 1977, and you see Joan Mondale on your right. And some of you may remember Carol Bellamy, who was president of the city council in New York at that time. And they came and spoke at the conference, and Joan Mondale gave her first feminist speech at that conference, so I was very proud of that. Eventually, I moved from the sphere of feminism into the mainstream, and I became president of the College Art Association as a result of my activities and my visibility in the feminist art movement. And I and others on the board, we worked very hard to transform the College Art Association from an organization of gray-suited men into one gray-suited white man, I should say, of a certain age, into an organization that welcomed women, minorities, artists, and curators who were even left out of the College Art Association. Nevertheless, I continued my life as an artist. This was a very exciting trip that I went on. 6 New Jersey artists had the opportunity to be the guests of the Union of Artists in the former USSR. And this was in 1990, just before the dissolution of the USSR. So it was during the Glasnost period when things were freer. Here you see us on the border of Lithuania. We went to Minsk, which was an extremely interesting place to go to at that time because of Chernobyl. And many of the artists in Minsk were dealing with the fallout, the nuclear fallout. There were a lot of bandaged images in their art. And we got stuck in Minsk because there was a little revolution that went on in Azerbaijan at that time. And so that prevented us from going to Azerbaijan. So they took us to Vilnius instead, which was equally interesting, I think. So then I left Rutgers administration. Although I considered it a performance piece, it meant that it was interfering with my life as an artist who made objects. I found that I just didn't have the time, and I had one of those, nighttime tossings and turnings about what was I going to do with the rest of my life, and it was very easy to decide. I thought, okay, if I'm on my deathbed and I look back on my life, what do I want to say I've done? Do I want to have been a university administrator, or do I want to make more art? And it was very clear to me that I wanted to make more art. So I went in and I resigned. I went back to the art department in New Brunswick at Mason Gross, and I established the Brodsky Center, which at that time I named the Rutgers Center for Innovative Print and Paper because everybody said, how can you establish an art center? And I said, well, there are science centers like the Center for Molecular and Behavioral Neuroscience. So I had to think of a title that would be equally impressive in order to get it approved by the university. So anyway, here you see Randy Hemminghouse, who's our master printer, with the artist Joan Snyder, who is a MacArthur Genius Award recipient, working on a printed image. And here, Anne McCune, working with an artist on a paper project. She's the master paper maker at the Brodsky Center at Rutgers, which is now celebrating its 25th anniversary and has worked with over 300 artists from all over the world during the last 25 years. As you may gather, my artwork is part of my life, but I also feel that one can have an impact on the world of art ideas through other things that one does in one's life too. And so my activism has really been, well, it's been part of my art. I really feel in some ways I've been able to affect a larger number of people than I would have just through my art alone. So my next stage was to start the Rutgers Institute for Women in Art with my colleague Ferris Olin, whom you see here. What we do at the Institute for Women in Art is promote women artists. We organize exhibitions, and we organize symposia. This was a major event that we mounted. We did an exhibition called How American Women Artists Invented Postmodernism, and we brought together all of the pioneers in the feminist art movement from the 1970s. They'd never been brought together in that whole period of time. So here you see Miriam Shapiro, Faith Ringgold, Joan Snyder, Carolee Schneemann, and many others who are now part of the pantheon of postmodern art. So eventually in my own work I got to do some pieces that addressed the issues of women and gender. This was a New York Times headline, "Stark Data on Women, 100 million are missing," about women all over the world who walk away from their lives. Their lives are so miserable, they can't stand it, they walk away, and they're never heard from again. So that was sort of the start of this, but then it went into other areas as well. For instance, one of the areas is the issue of dress. You know, for instance, here's this image of the chorus line, and how many people think about the fact that a chorus line consists of real women who are going to put on regular clothes after they appear in the theater, go home, cook dinner, take care of children, whatever. And I also was interested, this is another headline from the New York Times, it's at the bottom, wears jumpsuit, sensible shoes, uses husband's last name. And it was about the contradictions in women, how women have moved ahead in some ways and not in others. And then one of the pieces is this piece, which is about my daughter, who had this incident actually happened to her when she was at college, and she went to meet with the professor who was being assigned to her. She was a science person, still is, and he actually said this to her: "I don't want you as a student, you know, how can someone who wears red fingernail polish, you know, be a good scientist, be a serious scientist?" And so then today, she does have a prestigious research lab, but I've exaggerated. She does watch out for women. She's, you know, very, very good that way, but she also takes men into the program too. But, you know, artists have the right to exaggerate for the sake of their art. And so the center part of this, the text is printed, it's an etching, but then the fingernails are actually real fake fingernails, and they're in plastic bags. And I had to go raid several CVS's in order to find, you know, the right colors of fake fingernails. I continued to work on themes about women artists, about women, for a number of years. And this is a piece about Hannah Arendt, Martin Heidegger, and Edith Stein. And Martin Heidegger, of course, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, but he was an ardent Nazi, and such a strong Nazi that Hitler even was afraid of Heidegger. And Heidegger was appointed by Hitler to Nazify the German universities, which he did with a vengeance. His student was Hannah Arendt, who was the ultimate Jewish refugee, and his colleague was Edith Stein, another Jew who became a Christian and then became a nun under having had a vision of Saint Teresa of Avila, and you see the Bernini statue of Saint Teresa of Avila, who herself had come from a converso family. So this idea of, you know, Jewish women becoming Catholics and nuns over the centuries interested me a lot. Over on the left, you see Holocaust bodies because, and the text underneath refers to Husserl, who was the mentor for Heidegger and for Edith Stein. And when Husserl died, even though he had been Edith Stein's mentor, and she died, by the way, in Auschwitz. Her convent was, they were evacuated to Holland, and she was picked up as a Jew at the same time that Anne Frank was picked up and sent to Auschwitz. But at any rate, Heidegger was so important to these women that all she can think about is what's Heidegger thinking about Husserl's death. And I was struck by the ongoing power of the concept of romantic love, you know, from the 19th century, from Jane Eyre, for instance, where Jane Eyre, where Mr. Rochester says to Jane Eyre, "I want to marry you. You're poor, you're ugly, you have no friends, but somehow I love you." And she says, "Oh, Mr. Rochester, there's nothing that would make me happier than to be your wife," after he's, you know, said all these terrible things to her. So I think that concept of romantic love was so strong that both Hannah Arendt and Edith Stein continued to adore Heidegger even after, you know, he had been proved to be such an ardent Nazi. And this is also another piece in that series. This is based on a piece of lace from the Vienna Werkstätte, which was modernism, you know, incarnate at the beginning of the 20th century. They were trying to make crafts that were modern, and so the lace artisans decided, oh, we'll use nudes in it, and of course, instead of flowers or, you know, whatever else, or abstract design. So they use these nudes, but of course the nude is the traditional, conventional image of the female nude lying recumbent that goes back to the Renaissance, so they weren't being so new there. Community activity, I continue to be involved in the community. We just did a project at the Brodsky Center, which involved 20 artists who made prints for the new Capitol Health Hospital. And here you see some of the artists that were Joan Needham, whom some of you may know, and Chuck McVicker. The new hospital has gone up and is opening, I guess, very shortly down on 95, just below Princeton. The art that these artists were making was for the patient rooms. And here you see a model of the patient room with where the art was going to be, so that the patient lying in bed would be able to see the piece of art. Chuck McVicker working on his images. These were all monoprint editions. Some of them were digital, or the people who were photographers did digital editions, but those who were you know, traditional drawers and painters who work from a template. You can see the template for Joan Needham's piece, and then you paint on top of a piece of plexiglass. The plexiglass goes on the press, paper goes on top, you run it through the press, and the image is transferred onto the paper, then you go back and you paint it again. And so the lovely part about a monoprint edition is that there's a lot of variation. Here's the printer having pulled you know, a print by Chuck McVicker, and it turned into a community. Everybody got together at lunchtime and had a great time. And I thought I'd just show you a couple of these images. This is Ruane Miller, who teaches at College of New Jersey. Marie Sturken, whom some of you may know, a longtime Princeton artist. Here's Marie just having pulled a print. Maggie Johnson, whom some of you may also know, was one of her typical images. This is the piece by Joan Needham. And then my most recent finished project is an installation called Memoir of an Assimilated Family, and this is an installation about memory. I had run across boxes of wonderful old photographs that went back to the 19th century when my mother died, and this material was just too wonderful to put aside and not use. So I did, it's approximately 120 etchings that form this installation, and the idea is that the viewer comes in and is surrounded by my memories, not by documentation of my family, but by my memories. And so this is an image of my mother and her brothers when they were little, and this is Hyannis, Massachusetts. What a Jewish kosher family was doing in Hyannis, Massachusetts at that time is another story. Then this is my grandmother's backyard just at the beginning of World War II, one of the last family get-togethers before my uncles went off to war. This is my current husband, Michael Curtis. He grew up in England. This is about his family. He and his sister were evacuated during World War II. He was fine, but his sister went to a place where the father of the family abused the children, including his sister, and harmed her irrevocably, and she died shortly after giving birth to a son whom my husband Michael adopted and brought up. So just a family story that, you know, was really an interesting one. Sad but interesting. And then most of the prints in this have to do with older generations in my family, but at this time, after my mother had died and we were having the unveiling of her gravestone, my grandchildren, as you can see, were toddlers, and they went with us to the cemetery, And my granddaughter noticed that there were all these pebbles on the stones, some of the stones, and she said, "What are those for?" And we said, "Those are, pebbles to show that people remember the people who were buried here." And so she went around and collected all the stones and put them all on my mother's grave. Right now I'm working on a series called The 20 Most Important Scientific Questions of the 21st Century. This one is called Why Do They Sleep? And this one is called How Does the Brain Work? Some of the other questions, for instance, there's one, how many body parts can be replaced? And I'm having a terrible time with that one because there's so many different images that I could use. I just wanted to end by encouraging all of you here to be involved in the local art world. The Arts Council, I'm sure you are. There are many ways you can be involved if you're artists. Think of exhibitions that are theme exhibitions where you can show your work and show the work of people that you're interested in. If you're patrons, then by all means support the Arts Council and the University Museum, of course. You can come up to Rutgers occasionally too. We wouldn't mind that at all. Then I would encourage all of you to be involved in the larger art world of the New York art galleries and the art fairs. There's nothing more exciting than going to an art fair at the moment. This is an image of the Brodsky Center booth at the Editions and Artists Book Fair, which was just held in New York this past weekend. And there was another print fair that was at the Park Avenue Armory at the same time. There's a big fair that goes on the end of February, beginning of March, where you can go to the piers and go through hundreds of booths and get a really good sense of what's happening in the art world, and it's a lot of fun to do. And go to the Chelsea Galleries. The Chelsea Galleries are where the action is. They're between 10th and 11th Avenue, 20th to 27th Street. It's a very compact area. Some of those buildings have literally over 100 galleries just in one building alone. So it is really fun to go through all that. And then my last thing is to encourage you to buy art. It's not going to cost any more than a dinner at Elements. You can take a chance. Don't worry about your taste. Your taste is going to be fine. And buy something that you like. Buy local, as we say. And you can bargain. I just bargained for something at an art fair that I just went to, and got something at half the price that was being asked for. I hate to say it, I don't want to betray my fellow artists, but it's better to sell than not to sell. Prints are wonderful, they're cheaper. I'm a printmaker, so I encourage you to buy prints. It's a lot of fun to make a collection that focuses on a concept. You could collect local artists. You could collect works by women. You could collect prints and become addicted, because it really is fun to become addicted to art. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions. It's 9 o'clock. I realize it's time probably to go home. But if you have any questions, let me make a suggestion that, I'm going to be here closing up for a few minutes, and if you want to talk to me, I'd be happy to talk to you. And you've been a wonderful audience, and I've enjoyed looking at you, even though I haven't had a chance to speak with you.
Thank you.